question, how BIM can contribute to develop São Paulo?
You can actually use BIM to develop Sao Paulo by aggregating different disciplines and have a collaborative way of working in building information modeling. You can also use BIM to develop what we call a smart city, or to develop a 3D city of Sao Paulo for both above ground and above ground, so that you can actually use it for simulation, for example. And you can also use BIM for regulatory approval. You can use BIM to basically replace paper-based drawings to 3D models.
Convince the government to adopt BIM in their infrastructure works could be a turning point for Brazil.
In Singapore, for example, infrastructure represents about 60% of the construction cost yearly. So if you can influence that 60%, that would be beneficial to the society, because it means less rework. It means that the project will be clash-free. There's hardly any RFI, or request for information, and then it would be on schedule, because you can actually do simulation beforehand, before it's actually built.
Can you measure the return to the economy of using BIM in the construction?
The return to the economy. In essence, BIM at the very start is quite expensive, to be honest to you. It takes some time for training, and it takes some investment in software and hardware to implement BIM. So at the start of the implementation, it would be a little bit expensive. In Singapore, we realized that basically adds an additional 5% cost to the initial project, to the total project cost. But in terms of return of investment, you can clearly see that during construction, there's less rework, less errors during construction, and the BIM model is actually used during facility management, okay? And then it can be used to create, as I mentioned before, a 3D model of a city. So you can do a lot of simulation after a BIM model is created collectively. So in the terms of return of investment, it's really valid. I mean, it is worthy to embark on it.
One last question, what advice do you have for us in Brazil after your experience in BCA?
I mean, in Singapore, for example, BCA is heavily involved because we are the regulatory agency for construction drawings approval, or now it's construction model approval. I think you should start with the public sector first. As you mentioned, infrastructure is very, very big. So starting with infrastructure, you need to basically create guidelines, okay, or code of practice to basically convince the industry that BIM is important to them, okay? Or if they're not convinced, make it mandatory for them. Second, you have to address the issue of teaching BIM in the schools or the universities. Because how can you implement BIM in a project where your newly hired engineers cannot even operate one? Okay, so it is important to basically transform the computer-aided drafting into building information models. Okay, and lastly, you need to make sure that BIM is of use after the model is created. So after construction, what's next? So what is the use of BIM during facility management, during the operation and maintenance of a building is quite important.